My brother hit my niece in front of the whole family, then laughed and called us both worthless. I never imagined I'd be back at the lake house, not after everything it had represented throughout my life. But when my 6-year-old daughter Harper started asking about her grandparents and cousins, I told myself I could survive one weekend for her sake. I thought I could buffer her from the undercurrents that had shaped my childhood, from the cold glances and sharp words wrapped in smiles. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. It had been almost 4 years since I last saw my family in person, and even longer since I'd willingly engaged with them beyond obligatory birthday calls and forced holiday greetings. The invitation came 2 weeks earlier, tucked inside an envelope that still smelled like my mother's perfume. Summer weekend at Crystal Bay, the card announced in sweeping gold script, with an image of the sprawling cedar house perched on the edge of Lake Belmere. It looked exactly the same as I remembered, immaculate, cold, and expensive. Harper was ecstatic when I told her. She bounced on our worn sofa in our Kansas City apartment, her curls wild, her little voice shouting questions faster than I could answer. Would there be boats? Could she swim every day? Would Uncle Chad be there? I smiled and nodded, pushing aside the rising pit in my stomach. I hadn't told her what it was like to grow up in that house, what it meant to be the invisible child next to a brother who could do no wrong. Chad was 4 years older than me, and from the moment he could walk and speak in full sentences, our parents treated him like he walked on water. I, on the other hand, was labeled sensitive, difficult, too emotional. My father Martin ran a successful investment firm until his retirement, and my mother Joyce had once been a ballet instructor, though she gave that up shortly after Chad was born. Everything about their lives was neat, glossy, and curated. I never fit the mold, no matter how hard I tried. By the time I turned 15, I had stopped trying. I kept my head down, buried myself in books, and counted the months until I could escape. That escape came in the form of Wesley, a soft-spoken pre-law student I met during my first semester at Midwestern State. He told me I had the most thoughtful eyes he'd ever seen. He noticed things about me I didn't think anyone ever would. I married him a year later, hungry for love, hungry to build something better than what I came from. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. By the time Harper was 3, Wesley was working late every night, always checking his phone. I found the texts on a Thursday, dozens of them from someone named Tessa. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. We went through therapy, tried to patch things up, but it was clear he'd already moved on in every way that counted. We divorced quietly, without much fanfare. I told my family we had simply grown apart. I knew better than to hand them ammunition. That lie didn't stop my mother from offering her unsolicited opinion. Men don't just walk away from good marriages, Reagan, she said over the phone one day, her voice clipped and dry. I don't know what you did to drive him away, but you should reflect on it. That was the last time I asked them for anything until Harper needed emergency dental surgery and my health insurance hadn't kicked in yet. Even then, the help came wrapped in reminders that I was making poor life choices. Chad, meanwhile, had built the kind of life my parents liked to show off. He was vice president at a tech firm in Denver, married to a cardiologist named Fiona, and living in a 5-bedroom house with a wine cellar and his and hers closets. They didn't have children, not yet, but my parents adored Fiona and spoke about her as if she were some celestial gift. She wasn't unkind to me, just distant. Like someone watching a train wreck from a safe distance, curious but never close enough to feel the heat. Still, despite the weight of history and everything my gut warned me against, I agreed to go. I told myself Harper needed to know her roots, that she deserved memories of summer on the lake just like I had, even if mine came with emotional scars. Nina, my best friend since college, gave me that look, the one that said, "Are you sure?" without needing to say the words. I nodded anyway. The morning we left, I packed more than clothes. I packed Harper's favorite books, a first aid kit, her sketch pad, and her bunny she couldn't sleep without. But I also packed my walls, my practice smile, and every ounce of emotional armor I had built over the last decade. As we drove north through the winding back roads of Vermont, the trees lining the highway turned into towering green sentinels. The air thickened with the scent of pine and nostalgia I didn't want. I passed the old bakery I used to bike to every summer morning, the dock where Chad once dared me to jump in with my clothes on, the turnoff for Crystal Bay I hadn't taken in years. And then there it was, just as imposing as I remembered. The lake house hadn't changed at all. Still 3 stories of weathered wood and glass, still surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and silence that stretched between conversations like invisible barbed wire. Chad's new SUV was already parked beside our father's Mercedes. I pulled in behind them, turned off the engine, and closed my eyes for 3 full breaths before I could move. "We're here," Harper squealed from the back seat, already trying to unbuckle herself. Her joy was contagious, her excitement so pure it almost made me forget everything that waited inside. I smiled at her in the rearview mirror. "Let's go say hello." But something inside me whispered, "This weekend will change everything." I just didn't know how right it would be. The moment we stepped through the front doors, I could feel the shift in atmosphere. The smell of lemon oil and expensive furniture hit me like a memory I didn't ask for. My mother appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a pale blouse too fitted for comfort and an expression somewhere between forced warmth and critique. "Well, there she is," she said, scanning me from hairline to shoes before her gaze landed on Harper. "You've gotten so big," she added, bending to offer a shallow hug. Harper smiled politely, used to navigating adult energy, even when it was frigid. My father stood in the great room beside a roaring fireplace, despite the warm July air outside. His hand clutched a bourbon glass before noon, and he nodded at us without speaking. Some family members milled around the main room with paper plates and champagne flutes, moving like background actors in a play where only 2 people mattered, Chad and Fiona, who made their grand entrance from the kitchen. Chad wore a smug grin and an expensive button-down with his sleeves casually rolled, like he'd just come from closing a billion-dollar deal and stopped by to slum it with relatives. "Reagan," he said, drawing out my name like it was a question, "you're actually here." Then he looked down at Harper, cocking his head. "And this must be the karaoke machine I've heard so much about." He laughed as if it were charming, but something in his voice made me tense. Harper stepped a little closer to me, her smile fading. Fiona, ever the composed hostess, leaned in to greet me with a polite kiss on the cheek and said Harper could join the other children down by the dock. "They're already splashing around," she said with a practiced smile, as though nothing unpleasant had ever passed between us. Harper's face lit up again at the mention of swimming, and I told her she could go after we unpacked. The guest rooms had clearly been assigned with hierarchy in mind. Ours was tucked into the back corridor, facing the side yard. It was small, humid, and bore the unmistakable scent of mothballs and forgotten linens. I helped Harper unpack her little suitcase and hung her sundress on the door hook. "Do you think the lake will be cold?" she asked, looking out the window with her nose pressed to the glass. "I don't think you'll mind once you're in," I said, trying to push the unease from my voice. Later that evening, the entire family gathered in the great room for cocktails before dinner. The air hummed with conversations about renovations, mutual funds, and vacation homes. I sat at the edge of a leather sofa with a glass of sparkling water while Harper played quietly with some puzzle pieces nearby. My mother approached, her eyes scanning me again. "Still at that marketing firm?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "I actually lead a small team now." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Good for you," she said, like I was a child showing her a crayon drawing. "Steady work is important for single mothers." Chad jumped in from across the room. "I just wrapped up a partnership with an investor group in Montreal," he announced, as though responding to my sentence. "And Fiona is presenting at that pediatric summit next month in Toronto. Busy month for us." My father clapped Chad on the back. "My boy always moving forward," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. No one asked me another question. After dinner, as I helped in the kitchen, my Aunt Marla cornered me. "Chad mentioned you've been having some trouble since the divorce," she said in a tone that implied she had absolutely no concern about my answer. "Our HR department just opened a mailroom assistant position. I know it's not glamorous, but it's stable." I blinked, not sure whether to laugh or scream. "Thanks," I said, keeping my voice even. "But I'm already supervising projects." I appreciate the offer, though. That night, as I tucked Harper into bed, I noticed she was quieter than usual. She hugged her bunny tightly and stared at the ceiling. "Emma said I sing too loud," she whispered. "And Uncle Chad told me people won't like me if I'm noisy." My hands froze where they were smoothing the blanket. I knelt beside her bed. "Your voice is beautiful," I said, "and you should never be afraid to use it. Ever." She gave me a small smile, but I could see the confusion and doubt creeping into her face, like vines wrapping around something fragile. I stayed awake for hours after she fell asleep, listening to muffled laughter rising from downstairs. The weight in my chest grew heavier by the minute. I had brought her here hoping she'd feel included, like she had roots in something bigger than just the two of us. Instead, she was learning the same lessons I had at her age. Be quiet. Stay small. Don't take up space unless you're perfect. The next morning came fast and loud. Harper was up early, already dressed and begging to head down for breakfast. I brushed her hair and tied it with a yellow ribbon before we descended into the chaos of the great room, where an oversized breakfast buffet had been arranged by a hired catering team. My mother hovered near the espresso machine, instructing staff on presentation while my father buried himself behind a newspaper. Chad lounged in the corner with Fiona, sipping black coffee and talking real estate. Harper grabbed a waffle and some fruit before heading to the kids' table by the window. I joined one of the smaller adult circles and pretended to listen to a conversation about property tax loss. Meanwhile, Harper began to hum softly as she colored in her book, a tune from one of her favorite cartoons. It wasn't loud, just her usual habit of singing while focusing, but in the high-ceilinged room, her voice occasionally floated above the conversation. At first, it was harmless. Then I noticed Chad's jaw tightening every time Harper hit a high note. He looked over at me once, eyebrows raised in that smug, performative way, but I ignored it. Then came the whisper to his father, followed by the smirk I hadn't seen since childhood, the one that meant he thought he could do or say anything without consequence. My mother looked up and said, "Reagan, maybe Harper could tone it down a bit? It's early." Before I could say anything, Harper reached the chorus and sang out a little louder, completely unaware of the shift in mood. Then it happened, quick and brutal. Chad stood, his chair scraping back against the hardwood with a screech that silenced half the room. He marched across the floor toward Harper. I stood instinctively, but one of my aunts began asking me something about Harper's school, blocking me for just a few seconds. Those seconds changed everything. The slap was sharp and surreal. I heard it before I fully registered what was happening. Chad's hand struck Harper across the cheek with a flat crack that echoed through the room. My little girl's face twisted in pain and confusion as she recoiled, the coloring pencil dropping from her hand. Her chair tipped slightly. Every muscle in my body seized. Like mother, like daughter, Chad announced as if he'd delivered a punchline. Both can't control their mouths. My father chuckled behind his newspaper and muttered, "She needed to learn some humility." My mother laughed quietly, a clink of her spoon against china. Reagan was always a loud one. I pushed past my aunt and ran to Harper, who had begun to cry, her cheek already turning red. I scooped her up into my arms, my heart thundering in my chest. She shook as she clung to me. "What is wrong with you?" I spat at Chad, who stood with arms crossed, unbothered. "She's 6. She was singing. She's old enough to learn manners," he snapped. "This isn't a daycare. She's a child, and you assaulted her," I shouted, feeling the heat rise in my face. "If you ever touch her again," I didn't finish. "I didn't have to." Chad smirked, but behind him, someone had gone still. Miles, my cousin-in-law, who'd been hired to document the weekend, stood frozen by the audio rig near the piano, the same rig that had picked up everything in the room. He looked at me, eyes wide, hand hovering over the mic transmitter. The room buzzed with low, uncomfortable murmurs. Some relatives looked away. Others watched, stone-faced. And my parents sat quietly, sipping their drinks like it was all just a minor hiccup. I carried Harper out of that room with shaking hands and a cold clarity settling in my bones. They didn't know it yet, but everything had just changed. They thought they could humiliate me and hurt my child and laugh it off like they always had. But this time, they'd left a witness, and they left a trail of sound behind them. Back in our room, Harper curled into a ball on the bed, her fingers twisted tightly in her blanket as if she could wrap herself in safety and make the rest disappear. I sat beside her, breathing in shallow bursts, still replaying the sound of the slap and the expression on Chad's face. It wasn't just the physical impact that had shattered something inside me, it was the applause of silence that followed, the quiet agreement in the room that my daughter somehow deserved it. Her cheek was already blotched pink and hot to the touch. I ran a cold washcloth under the faucet, wringing it out with trembling hands before pressing it gently to her face. She winced, not just from pain, but from betrayal too deep for a child to articulate. "Mom," she whispered, "did I do something wrong? Am I not supposed to sing here?" I don't know how I managed to keep my voice even when I said, "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. Uncle Chad was the one who was wrong." I didn't want her to see me cry, but a single tear slipped down my cheek as I stroked her hair. That sound, the sound of her crying, mixed with the weight of generational cruelty, I'd never forget it. I had wanted Harper to experience family, but I had dragged her into a den of orchestrated cruelty where status trumped love and silence was the currency of belonging. There was a knock at the door. I froze, positioning myself between Harper and whoever stood behind the wood. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "It's Miles," came the hushed reply. I opened the door just enough to meet his eyes. He looked pale and shaken. "I got it," he whispered. "The slap, what Chad said after, your father's comment, all of it." The microphone picked up everything. My breath caught. "Can you give me a copy?" I asked, unsure if I was being reckless or brave. "I can put it on a USB before they realize what's on the master file," he said. "Give me an hour, and meet me out back near my car." I nodded, barely able to speak. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew it was the one thing they hadn't planned for, someone watching from outside the walls they built to protect themselves. After Miles left, I called Nina. I hadn't even said hello before I broke. "Chad hit her," I choked. "Right there in front of everyone." And they laughed. My parents laughed. The silence on the other end lasted only a second. "Are you still there?" she asked. "You need to leave." "Reagan, right now? Come straight to my apartment. You shouldn't go home. If they think you're angry enough to do something, they'll come after you in ways you haven't imagined." I packed quickly, grabbing Harper's clothes, her bunny, our toiletries, and stuffed everything into 2 overnight bags. She was dozing again, drained from crying, and I didn't want to wake her until we were ready to leave. I slipped out quietly and met Miles behind a line of pines where his car was parked near the service drive. He handed me a small drive with a yellow sticker on it. "It's all here," he said. "Crystal clear. They'll know it came from me eventually, so be careful." I nodded and promised I wouldn't involve him unless absolutely necessary. As I pulled away from the lake house with Harper asleep in the back seat, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused. Something inside me had locked into place. A part of myself I didn't know was still intact after years of brushing off slights and swallowing shame. Nina had set up her guest room before I arrived. She wrapped Harper in a blanket and carried her upstairs like she'd done it 100 times before. After Harper was tucked in, we sat at her kitchen table, the USB drive between us like it held the entire future in its shell. "Do you want to hear it?" she asked softly. I nodded. I need to remember exactly what they said, not what I hope I misheard. The audio played in brutal clarity. Harper's innocent singing, the scrape of the chair, the slap. The casual cruelty in Chad's voice when he called us useless, followed by my father's smug approval and my mother's detached laughter. It was worse than I remembered, but it also confirmed everything I'd buried for so long. "This isn't just about Chad anymore," Nina said when the recording ended. "This is about a system that's been running in your family forever, and you just caught it red-handed." I wanted justice, but I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to go public for attention or create some social media firestorm. I wanted accountability. I wanted Chad to know there were lines he could no longer cross without consequences. And I wanted my daughter to understand that people in power don't get to rewrite the truth when it suits them. The next morning, I scheduled a doctor's appointment for Harper. The pediatrician confirmed soft tissue bruising and recorded everything in her notes. "This may not seem like much now," she said, "but documentation like this matters." She also referred us to a child therapist, Dr. Lang, who specialized in trauma recovery. I wasn't sure Harper fully understood the gravity of what had happened, but I could already see it changing her. The hesitation when speaking, the way she looked at the door when someone knocked. When we met with Dr. Lang, she was warm and patient. After observing Harper draw pictures and talk through what had happened, she sat me down with a folder of clinical notes. "She's exhibiting early signs of acute stress response," she said. "There's anxiety around authority figures, withdrawal from singing, difficulty sleeping. I'm recommending weekly therapy for now." I didn't cry until I got back to the car. I sat there in the parking lot with my head against the steering wheel, letting myself fall apart for exactly 6 minutes before I started writing an outline. I needed to organize my thoughts, what happened, what was said, what the audio captured, and how it connected to Chad's public life. It was no secret Chad had built his image on being a leader and mentor. He sat on the board of a tech startup that promoted education for underprivileged youth. He volunteered with a mentorship program in Boulder, and he had just posted about his upcoming keynote at a business leadership conference. I knew all this because my parents never stopped talking about it. He was the shining example, the name they dropped at brunches and charity fundraisers. I started crafting a message, not to the press, not to random strangers, but to the people who had entrusted Chad with power and influence. I attached a carefully edited audio clip that included only the essential parts: the slap, the insult, the comment about shame, the laughter. I wrote a brief, professional explanation of what happened, requested confidentiality, and sent it to 3 places: Chad's firm, the nonprofit where he served on the board, and the youth mentorship program. Nina stood behind me as I hovered over the send button. "Once you do this, you can't take it back," she said. "Are you sure?" I thought about Harper's face after the slap, how she shrank into herself, how her song died in her throat. "I'm sure," I said, and hit send. The first call came 4 hours later. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. It was a member of the HR team at Chad's firm, requesting a meeting with him to discuss an urgent ethics concern. Then came the email from the nonprofit. "We've received concerning material regarding Mr. Chad's conduct. We are initiating an immediate review." By evening, his mentorship program had quietly removed his photo from their website. Chad must have known where it came from. His texts came in fast and furious, first demanding, then pleading, then threatening. "You don't know what you've started," he wrote. "You'll regret this." My parents weren't far behind. My mother accused me of being unstable, obsessed with tearing the family down. My father called it a betrayal. I didn't respond. I wasn't playing their game anymore. Later that night, I got a message from Fiona, short, shaky, and completely unexpected. I heard the audio. "I'm staying with my sister for now. I had no idea it was this bad. I'm sorry." That message felt like a crack in the wall Chad had built around his image. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel safe. But I felt something close to hope. For the first time in years, I had told the truth without apologizing for it, and someone had finally listened. The days that followed felt like walking through a house that was collapsing in slow motion, dust in the air, beams groaning, and no one acknowledging the ceiling was falling. The first official news came from a colleague of Chad's who emailed me privately, confirming he'd been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The email was short, almost clinical, but the implication was enormous. The firm wasn't brushing this aside. They were taking it seriously. The children's organization moved even faster. Their board issued a statement within 48 hours of receiving my audio file, announcing Chad had been removed permanently due to a violation of their ethical standards. I read the message 3 times, hardly believing the words. It wasn't just talk, it was action. That meant something. I kept everything quiet from Harper, who was slowly beginning to sleep through the night again. She had returned to humming while she played, which felt like a sacred victory. Dr. Lang said the early signs of confidence were promising, and that if she kept rebuilding her sense of safety, her voice would return completely. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed constantly with messages I didn't ask for. My father sent a message that read, "You've turned this into a circus. All for what pity?" My mother texted, "Your grandmother wants to speak to you. Maybe she can bring you back to reason." I ignored both. There was no reasoning with people who believed violence was just another tool in a parenting toolbox. Then, unexpectedly, my grandmother did call me. Her voice was quieter than I remembered, and she didn't bother with pretense. "I want the family together this Sunday," she said. "Everyone. No exceptions." I paused, unsure whether she meant it as a lecture or a lifeline. "I'm not bringing Harper," I told her. "That part of the story is closed." She surprised me by agreeing. "She's been through enough. This is for adults. I want truth spoken." I arrived at her home on the edge of Woodcrest just before 2, nerves tapping at my ribcage like they'd found a hollow drum. The house smelled like lavender and old furniture, just like it had since I was little. I sat in the parlor surrounded by people who once called themselves my family, And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the only one who'd finally done something real. Chad stood near the fireplace, arms folded, hair unkempt, eyes ringed with frustration. Fiona wasn't beside him. She sat instead on the other side of the room next to her sister, lips pressed tight. My parents sat together stiffly, and I recognized the glint in my mother's eyes, more concerned with control than consequence. When my grandmother entered the room, silence fell like a curtain. She moved slowly but deliberately, leaning on her cane with her shoulders back, like someone ready to pronounce judgment. "I've listened to the audio," she said without preamble. "I've heard exactly what happened, and I am ashamed, not of Reagan, but of the rest of you." Chad scoffed and looked away. My father opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. "I raised you better, Martin. I may have failed at stopping your father from doing the same to you, but that cycle ends now. You condone violence against your own grandchild. You laughed while she cried, and you did it thinking there'd never be a cost." No one spoke for a long moment. Then Chad finally said, "It was one slap. She was screaming like a banshee. Everyone is blowing this up to ruin me." I looked at him and for the first time didn't feel anger. I felt pity. He had no idea what real accountability looked like because he had never once been made to hold anything heavy that he hadn't dropped on someone else. "She was singing," I said quietly. "And even if she wasn't, you still hit a child in public and expected applause. This isn't about your career. It's about what you've become." My mother stood, probably to defend him, but my grandmother shut that down too. "Joyce, I love you, but your silence has been complicity. You've smoothed over every sharp edge in this family until we lost all sense of right and wrong." More voices followed. My cousin Elise admitted she'd seen Chad push her son once during a holiday argument. My uncle revealed that years ago Chad had verbally berated a server at a country club event while my parents laughed it off. Story after story painted a picture I already knew by heart. This family didn't punish power. It protected it. Until now. Then Fiona stood, her voice soft but unwavering. "I'm filing for divorce," she said. I stayed silent for too long because I convinced myself he'd never cross certain lines. But that audio, he didn't even hesitate. He hit a child and then blamed her for it. The room grew still. Chad didn't argue. He just sat down, looking suddenly much smaller. When it was finally over, my grandmother turned to me, her expression unreadable. "You did something hard," she said, "but necessary. It will take time, but I believe this family can be rebuilt if it learns to choose truth over tradition." I nodded, unsure what to say. For the first time, someone had chosen me without needing me to be anything other than honest. In the weeks that followed, things didn't return to normal, but they shifted. My parents began attending family counseling sessions, not out of remorse, but likely because they feared losing access to Harper permanently. I made it clear that they wouldn't see her until they understood what accountability meant, not just as a word, but as a change in behavior. Harper, for her part, had begun singing again, this time louder, freer, sometimes with made-up lyrics that made her laugh so hard she snorted. I'd never heard anything more healing than that sound. Dr. Lang said her progress was better than expected and that the trauma was no longer defining her, just something she was learning to step over. And me? I applied for a leadership position at work, something I never would have imagined doing months ago. I got it. My boss said she saw a strength in me that came through even under pressure. Calm, determined, and fiercely protective. She said I had the kind of resilience that couldn't be taught. The last thing I expected to feel was gratitude. Not for what happened, never that, but for the clarity it forced into my life. My voice was no longer quiet or apologetic. It had weight now, and it came with truth. And for the first time, when I spoke, I knew it was being heard. 6 months had passed since that morning at the lake house, and for a while, life finally felt still. Harper had returned to her full-volume self, filling our apartment with songs from every cartoon, musical, and melody her mind could remember. She even joined a small children's choir at the community center, and when I saw her perform for the first time in front of strangers, I cried silently in the back row. The way she sang, fearless and bright-eyed, was proof that healing didn't always arrive in dramatic bursts. It sometimes unfolded in quiet defiance. Work had shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated either. Since stepping into the team leadership role, I felt like someone had handed me a different version of myself, a version that walked into rooms without shrinking, spoke in meetings without needing approval, and made decisions without waiting for permission. My boss, who once spoke to me like I was barely qualified to take notes, now looped me in on strategy meetings and deferred to my opinion in front of clients. Something in me had clicked. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something. My parents were slowly attempting a version of reconciliation, though I made it clear that no contact with Harper would occur unless it happened under structured supervision. They didn't protest, probably because they were still reeling from the consequences of what they allowed that weekend. Their attempts at conversation were cautious and stilted, like people walking barefoot across broken glass. I didn't meet them with open arms, but I no longer met them with rage either. I was tired of burning and ready for distance instead. Chad had all but disappeared from my world, and I preferred it that way. After his demotion at work and Fiona's divorce filing, he retreated into silence, at least where I was concerned. I heard through extended family that he'd moved to a smaller apartment downtown and was attending court-mandated anger management classes. I didn't care about his progress. I didn't want revenge. I only wanted assurance that he would never again hold authority over a vulnerable child or anyone he could hurt with his words or hands. Then, one Thursday afternoon, I received an unmarked package in my mailbox. No return address, just my name, neatly written in block letters. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note that read, "You might want to hear this. Be careful who you trust." My stomach tightened instantly. The handwriting didn't look familiar, but I recognized the message for what it was, a warning wrapped in information. Nina came over that night, and together we played the audio on my laptop. What we heard nearly made me sick. It wasn't just Chad's voice, though it was unmistakably him. It was a conversation between Chad and my father, recorded, God knows how, during the early months after Harper was born. They were discussing revisions to a family trust, one I had no idea even existed. My father mentioned reducing the distribution list. Chad had responded, "Reagan's kid won't even notice if we cut her out. She won't know what she's missing. Let's keep it in the bloodline that counts." I sat there frozen, barely breathing, the implications swirling in my mind faster than I could process them. They hadn't just dismissed me emotionally. They had actively worked to erase Harper's future behind my back. It wasn't just abuse or neglect. It was financial manipulation, an intentional act to diminish my child's right to a piece of the family estate. I wasn't surprised, but I was furious in a way that didn't burn, it calcified. My next step wasn't rage. It was a lawyer. The legal process wasn't glamorous or quick, but it was decisive. Once I handed over the second audio clip and provided documentation from Harper's pediatrician and therapist, my attorney filed for a full audit of the trust. The court ruled in our favor. Not only had Chad and my father violated the terms of the original estate, but they had also concealed material information that impacted Harper's legal stake. The judge's ruling reinstated her as a rightful beneficiary and placed restrictions on both my father and Chad from making any further amendments without outside review. When the verdict came down, I didn't gloat. I didn't throw a victory party. I picked up Harper from school like any normal Thursday, and we got ice cream from her favorite corner shop. She talked the whole walk home about an art project and how she might write a song about a flying fox. I smiled and nodded, letting her voice wrap around me like armor. Later that night, after she was asleep, I stood on our tiny balcony, the city buzzing below, the stars faint behind the clouds. My phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. "You destroyed us," it said. I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it without replying. No, I hadn't destroyed anything. They had built something cruel and hollow and expected it to stand forever. I simply lit a match and walked away.